They remembered her as the nation's smiling grandmother, a tiny woman in pearls with a warm voice, a bright face, and the strange ability to make every stranger feel personally chosen. But behind that perfect smile was another Elizabeth, a woman raised to expect comfort, a woman who could turn charm into control, a woman who could forgive the public anything yet hold a private grudge for decades. Her name was Elizabeth Bowes Lyon. History would later call her the Queen Mother, wrap her in courage, and place her among the most beloved figures of the British monarchy. But before the legend, there was a privileged girl from a family that looked like old Britain carved in stone. Her father was Claude Bowes Lyon, the Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. Her mother, Cecilia, moved through aristocratic life as if rank were law. Elizabeth grew up between St. Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire and Glamis Castle in Scotland, surrounded by servants, horses, family secrets, and the quiet belief that some people were born to be obeyed. She was the second youngest in a crowded family. Elizabeth learned how to be noticed without seeming needy. She learned when to laugh, when to lower her voice, and when to make adults feel clever for admiring her. Early, she discovered that charm could excuse almost anything. The Great War gave her a darker lesson. Glamis Castle became a place for wounded soldiers. Elizabeth brought tea, comfort, and a gentle face into rooms heavy with pain. There was real compassion in her, but also discovery. Sympathy, offered by the right woman in the right room, could become power. After the war, British society wanted beauty again. Dinners, dances, and country weekends returned. Then came Prince Albert, Duke of York, the second son of King George V and Queen Mary. His older brother Edward was the shining Prince of Wales, loved by crowds and photographed like a star. Albert was different. He was shy, anxious, and wounded by a stammer that made public speaking feel like punishment. Albert fell for Elizabeth quickly. He needed her confidence and her warmth. Elizabeth saw that need, and she understood it. Admiration was pleasant. Need was more useful. When Albert proposed, she refused. Then she refused again. To the world, it looked like romantic hesitation, but it also set the rhythm of their future. She would decide. He would wait. In 1923, Elizabeth accepted him. At Westminster Abbey, she laid her bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior. It was a moving tribute. In one moment, she connected herself to the mourning of ordinary families and appeared to understand the pain of the whole country. As Duchess of York, Elizabeth entered royal life and quickly learned its machinery. Queen Mary was strict and obsessed with duty. Courtiers guarded tradition. Servants heard everything. Elizabeth smiled at all of them. She listened. She remembered weaknesses. She seemed sweet, but her sweetness could freeze. At 145 Piccadilly, the London home she shared with Albert, Elizabeth built a softer kingdom. Comfortable rooms, fresh flowers, warm dinners, laughter. The public loved the picture of a shy prince, a charming wife, and a household that looked like a storybook. But the private truth was sharper. Elizabeth wanted everything done her way. She spent freely on clothes, fabrics, flowers, food, and decoration. She called it maintaining standards. Albert hated discussing money, and Elizabeth believed people of their class should not have to worry about costs. Her tastes kept growing. With staff, she could be generous 1 hour and icy the next. A lost glove, a slow footman, a failed arrangement could feel to her like personal disrespect. She rarely shouted. She did something worse. Her voice tightened, the room cooled, and everyone understood that someone had displeased her. Then, in public, she would smile as if nothing had happened. In 1926, her first daughter was born. Princess Elizabeth was small, serious, and already strangely watchful. She was third in line to the throne. Everyone assumed Edward would marry and have children, but the child still changed her mother's position. Elizabeth was now the mother of a possible future. In 1930, Princess Margaret arrived lively and emotional. Elizabeth adored both girls, but differently. The older Elizabeth was dutiful and careful. Margaret was charm, mischief, and drama. She reminded Elizabeth of herself, and that made her easier to enjoy and easier to spoil. Meanwhile, Edward was becoming the family's glittering danger. He was handsome, restless, modern, and adored by the public. He treated duty like an inconvenience and pleasure like a calling. Elizabeth watched him with growing alarm. If Edward created a scandal, Albert could be pulled toward a role he feared. Then a new name entered the royal world. Wallis Simpson. She was American stylish sharp, divorced once, married again, and not at all humble before royalty. Elizabeth disliked her before she even needed to know her. Wallis represented modern manners, divorce, and female confidence outside the old rules. Worst of all, Edward seemed to need her. By the early 1930s, Wallis was no passing flirtation. Edward revolved around her. Friends saw it. Courtiers feared it. Queen Mary was horrified. King George V was furious and worried. Elizabeth understood what others hoped to avoid saying. If Edward insisted on Wallis, the monarchy could face disaster. By 1935, King George V was visibly weaker. The palace waited for two things at once: the king's decline and Edward's next mistake. Elizabeth pushed Albert toward readiness. She spoke of duty, stability, and the country. She never said she wanted the crown. She did not need to. She framed every ambition as service. In January 1936, King George V died at Sandringham. Edward became king at once. Albert was shaken. Queen Mary became stone. Elizabeth stayed calm. She saw what Edward did not. The crown does not adjust itself to the man. The man must adjust to the crown. Edward did not adjust. As King Edward VIII, he resisted old rituals, ignored advice, grew impatient with ministers, and moved Wallis closer to royal life. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin understood the danger. The king wanted to marry a woman who was still married and had a living former husband. The Church of England, the government, the dominions, and the old royal establishment could not accept her as queen. Elizabeth's dislike hardened into contempt. To her, Wallis was a threat to everything Elizabeth had built. Elizabeth had followed the rules, supported Albert, and polished the monarchy into something lovable. Now this American woman had broken the rules and still sat close to the king. Elizabeth did not shout. She used exclusion. Perfect politeness became a wall. Through 1936, the crisis grew. British newspapers stayed cautious at first, but foreign papers made the affair impossible to hide. Edward wanted to speak directly to the public and make it a love story. Baldwin saw a constitutional fire. Elizabeth saw something else too. If Edward refused duty, Albert would have to stand. At Royal Lodge, Albert panicked. He did not want the throne or that life for his daughters. Elizabeth held his hand and told him he could not fail. She had made him stronger for years. With the help of speech therapist Lionel Logue, through practice, pressure, and praise. Now the project was no longer private. It was national. In December 1936, Edward chose Wallis and gave up the crown. Albert became King George VI. Elizabeth became queen. She did not leap with joy. She did something more revealing. She steadied herself as if she had been preparing all along. The abdication wounded the monarchy, and Elizabeth made Edward pay for it. He became Duke of Windsor. Wallis became Duchess of Windsor after their marriage, but she was not allowed the style Her Royal Highness. To Elizabeth, the woman blamed for the crisis would not be fully welcomed as royal. In May 1937, George VI and Queen Elizabeth were crowned at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony had been planned for Edward, but now it repaired a national rupture. Edward stayed away. George VI endured the ceremony with strain and dignity. Elizabeth appeared radiant, composed, and completely sure of her place. The crowds cheered, but Europe was darkening. The next test was not family scandal. It was war. In September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. The question came quickly. Would the King and Queen leave London? Elizabeth gave the answer that became her line of steel. The children would not go without her. She would not go without the King, and the King would never go. Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret were moved mostly to Windsor for safety. Their parents stayed visible. Elizabeth knew the power of that decision. If she fled, she would be remembered as a coward. If she stayed, danger itself would become loyalty. In September 1940, Buckingham Palace was bombed. Glass broke, stone cracked. Smoke entered rooms built for ceremony. Elizabeth did not collapse. She looked at the damage and turned it into one of the strongest images of the war. She said she was glad the palace had been bombed, because now she could look the East End in the face. It was brave. It was brilliant. She understood suffering, but she also understood appearances. The wounded palace made the crown seem closer to wounded London. After that, her visits to bomb sites became wartime theatre at its most effective. She spoke warmly to families in rubble. People cried. They believed she saw them. Winston Churchill understood the value of that image. He needed the monarchy to hold morale together. Elizabeth needed Churchill to keep the crown secure in public affection. Their bond was partly sincere and partly strategic. He treated her as important, and she liked being important. Edward remained a shadow. In 1940, the Duke of Windsor was sent to the Bahamas as governor. Officially, it was service. In practice, it kept him far from the center of war. Elizabeth approved. She had not forgiven him, and war gave her anger a patriotic shape. Wallis remained outside. Elizabeth's revenge could now be called principle. In 1945, victory in Europe brought crowds into London. The royal family appeared on the balcony, and the public roared as if the monarchy itself had helped carry the nation through the fire. Yet peace did not heal everything. George VI was exhausted. He smoked too much, worked too hard, and aged quickly. Post-war Britain was poorer and less patient with extravagance. Elizabeth presented the monarchy as warm, stable, and necessary. But privately, she still loved comfort. Fine clothes, her belief in royal standards survived every shortage. In 1947, Princess Elizabeth married Philip. He was a young naval officer, confident, blunt, and not easy for the old court. Elizabeth was cautious. She wanted a husband for her daughter who would fit and not threaten her influence. But the young princess loved Philip, and the marriage went forward. In February 1952, George VI died. Princess Elizabeth was in Kenya when she became Queen Elizabeth II. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon became the Queen Mother. This could have pushed her to the edge of the royal stage. Instead, she created a new role so perfectly that the public nearly forgot it was a creation. She became the brave widow, the mother of the young queen, the familiar elder in bright hats, the living memory of wartime courage. Clarence House became her domain. She entertained, went racing, kept loyal staff, and expected her preferences to matter. She could be generous and warm. She could also be demanding, expensive, and easily offended. With Queen Elizabeth II, she offered advice that often sounded like expectation. With Philip, she could be wary, because he was a rival voice near her daughter. With Margaret, the bond was messier. Margaret had Elizabeth's sparkle and hunger for affection. Elizabeth spoiled her, then judged her when that same spirit became inconvenient. The crisis returned when Margaret loved Peter Townsend, a war hero who was older and divorced. To the public, it was romance. To Elizabeth, it was the ghost of Edward and Wallis walking back through the door. Divorce again. Duty again. Love against the monarchy again. The relationship was delayed, managed, and finally broken. Margaret gave him up. In 1972, Edward died in Paris. The family behaved correctly at the funeral. Correctness was one of Elizabeth's great skills, but correctness was not forgiveness. In her mind, Edward had betrayed the family, forced Albert onto the throne, shortened his life with stress, and endangered everything she had fought to protect. As the decades passed, the Queen Mother became a national fixture. People saw the bright hats, the smile, the courage, the link to the Blitz, the grandmother of Britain. They did not see as clearly the private machinery behind the myth. The staff, the bills, the grudges, the belief that comfort was her right and disagreement was disrespect. In 2002, Princess Margaret died. Only weeks later, on March 30th, 2002, Elizabeth died at Royal Lodge in Windsor. She was 101. The public mourned as if they had lost a grandmother. They remembered courage, warmth, and a century of history. All of that was true, but it was not the whole truth. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon was brave, clever, disciplined, and emotionally brilliant. She held the monarchy together when it might have cracked. But she was also spoiled by privilege, sharpened by pride, and capable of deep spite. She punished enemies with perfect manners. She used duty to justify control. That is why her story is so uncomfortable. She was not a saint, and she was not a simple villain. She was something more dangerous and more human. A woman who understood that the public forgives many sins when you make it feel safe. A woman who smiled, held her ground, and made history bend around